His third eye blinked out of sync, and he did not know why. Grand Admiral Vethos Canna sat alone in the dark, and his own body had just done something it had never done in 30 years of war. He pressed 2 fingers to the lid until it stilled. On the console in front of him, a report glowed pale blue. 2 paragraphs, nothing more. A species dismissed in less time than it took to finish a cup of tea gone cold. For 3 decades, no threat had ever made his hands shake. Now his own bridge crew had started to panic over a single human warship sitting motionless in restricted space. And the worst part was this. He could not tell them, yet that panic was the correct response. 41 years ago, the Empire had looked at Earth and written the word irrelevant. 41 years later, one of their ships had made his best sensor officer forget how to speak. The wrong detail was small. It always was. On the report's second line, the filing date had been altered, not erased, not hidden, just quietly updated, as if someone on the other side had wanted him to notice that they knew he'd be reading it tonight. He read the 2 paragraphs again. He still did not understand how a species with no strategic concern had ended up standing over him. "Tell us we're not worth watching," a voice had said to him only hours ago, calm as still water, and see what 40 years of that energy produces. He had not answered her then. He was not sure he had an answer now. Somewhere past the reinforced glass of his private office, the Eternal Dominion floated dead in space, disarmed by treaty, boarded by a species his own empire had forgotten existed. He set the report down. He opened a blank page. His hand did not shake, and that surprised him more than anything else that night. "I should warn you now, before you hear how this started. What I saw tonight will change how you think about every harmless species report you've ever read. Stay with me." 19 hours earlier, none of this had a name yet. "Sir, I've got something." Sensor Chief Don Vask's voice cracked on the second word, and in 9 years serving under Canna, it had never cracked once. Canna crossed the bridge without hurrying. Hurrying was for officers who hadn't yet learned that fear looked worse than the thing you were afraid of. The bridge of the Eternal Dominion hummed around him, cold blue hololight sliding over crystalline consoles, 40 senior officers murmuring low in high velari, the way they always did at the start of a shift that would turn out to be ordinary. This one wouldn't be. "Show me." Vask's 4 fingers moved fast over his panel and failed to bring up a single clean number. Grid Sector 977, one contact. No drive signature, no thermal bloom, nothing on any registered hull profile. He swallowed. "Sir, the system won't classify it." "Then reclassify the system." Canna leaned over the display. A shape sat in the dark, small at this range, silent, patient in a way debris never managed to be. "Run it against the civilian registries, then the pirate registries, then everything else." "Already did. Nothing matches. Nothing's close." Fleet Captain Thal arrived at Canna's shoulder, arms crossed, the picture of 30 decorated years standing very still. Could be a sensor fault. Could be. Canna did not believe it, and something in his chest, old, animal, unfamiliar, agreed with him. He watched the contact for 11 seconds without blinking. Then he gave the order that ended the ordinary part of the night. "Full active scan, all arrays. I want a number on that hull before I finish this sentence." The bridge went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone in it decides, all at once, not to breathe too loudly. Numbers began climbing across the display, and none of them made sense. Vask read them off in a voice that kept dropping half an octave. "Sir, length reading is climbing past anything in the registry. It's still climbing." "Define climbing." 80 kilometers, sir. The hull is 80 kilometers long." Nobody on the bridge said anything for 3 full seconds, which on a warship built for instant answers was closer to an eternity. The Eternal Dominion herself ran 3 kilometers stem to stern, the largest hull the Empire had ever put into service, 12 planetary cannons, 12,000 crew, a ship that had never once needed to explain itself to anyone. 26 of her would fit inside the thing sitting quiet in the dark. "Run it again," Canna said, and his voice did not shake, though something behind his ribs had started to. Archivist Sorrel's station chirped. She was already 3 systems deep in something no one had asked her for yet, her fingers a blur. Sir, I pulled a trade log. 43 years old, half corrupted. Mentions a patrol vessel flying under something called the United Earth Space Navy. Earth, Thal said the word like it tasted wrong. That's the pre-warp survey world. Class 3. What in the void is a United Earth Space Navy? No one answered him. No one could. The hull on the display resolved further, and what had looked like simple dark now looked like something that ate the light around it, rather than reflecting any of it back. Weapons platforms began populating along its flank, one after another, the count climbing past what any targeting computer on the Dominion had ever been asked to track in a single hostile contact. 60 identified so far, Vask said. Systems still counting. It hasn't stopped counting. Canna felt the old animal thing in his chest settle into something colder and more useful. Fear, once you stopped fighting it, made an excellent analyst. Pull anything the Empire has on file for Earth. Survey reports. Anything. Sorrel's answer came back in under a minute, which told him she'd expected the request. One file, sir, 41 years old, filed by a survey team archived, never revisited. She hesitated. It's 2 paragraphs long. Read it. Species designation, human. Classification, class 3 developing. No strategic concern, no monitoring required. Sorrel's voice thinned out on the last 4 words, the way a person's voice does when they hear, in real time, exactly how wrong something used to be. Canna stared at the 80-kilometer hull sitting in the dark, patient, unbothered, in no apparent hurry to explain itself. 41 years. No monitoring required. Sir, Vask's hand had gone still on his panel, which was somehow worse than the shaking. New contacts. Multiple. I'm reading. He stopped, cleared his throat, tried again. I'm reading 47 more of them. Same hull signature. They were running so cold my system logged them as debris. The bridge lights did not change. Nothing about the ship physically shifted. But every officer on that deck felt the room get smaller, the way it does when a number arrives that the mind cannot immediately hold. Canna kept his voice level because that was the only thing left he could control. Get me a channel. Open, wide band, every frequency we've got. Before Sorrel could answer, the console did it for her. A single audio channel lit green across the boards, unrequested, uninvited, already open. A voice came through it, flawless in galactic common, unhurried in the exact way a thing sounds unhurried when it has genuinely never needed to rush. Eternal Dominion, this is UESN unbroken. You are inside a restricted exclusion zone. Power down weapons and stand by for compliance instructions. Nobody on the bridge moved. Canna looked at the 80-kilometer shape on the display, then at the 47 cold shadows spread wide around it like teeth, and understood, with the flat clarity of a man watching a door close from the wrong side, that the compliance window had already started counting down whether he answered it or not. 10 minutes. That was what the Unbroken had given him, and 8 of them were already gone. Canna kept his voice level for the bridge, though the animal thing behind his ribs had stopped pretending to be calm. Compose a response. Standard identification protocol. We are within our claimed territory and require confirmation of authority before. Sir, Sorrel's hands had stopped moving entirely, which frightened him more than when they'd been shaking. I found something. It's not going to help. Say it. The Treaty of Proyan, signed by the Imperial Senate 14 years ago. I never flagged it before because nobody's touched the file in a decade. It cedes the entire exclusion zone, this sector, all of it, to Earth sovereignty. She looked up at him, and for the first time in 9 years, he saw something in Sorrel's face he'd never seen there before. The specific dread of a person who has just realized her own government signed away the ground she is currently standing on. Thal made a sound low in his throat. We're the ones in violation. Canna did not answer him, because the channel chose that moment to open itself again, the way it had the first time, without asking permission. Eternal dominion. The voice was a woman's, unhurried, warm in a way that made the warmth feel more dangerous than a threat would have. I notice you haven't powered down. I also notice you've spent your window running my treaty citation instead of complying with it. Smart. Slow, but smart. This is Grand Admiral Vethos Canna commanding. He kept his spine straight, though nobody on the bridge could see it shake if it had. To whom am I speaking? Captain Yararoe, UESN Unbroken. You're currently sitting inside Earth's exclusion zone under the Treaty of Proyan, Article 12, which your government signed and apparently forgot existed. Article 12 grants Earth vessels the right to board, inspect, and if necessary detain any craft found in violation. A pause, unbothered, almost amused. You are in violation. Canna looked at the 80-kilometer hull on the display, then at the 47 smaller shadows ringed around it, patient as a closing hand. Somewhere behind him, Vask had gone completely silent, and the silence itself was a kind of scream. I request time to consult the full treaty text before responding. You have 3 minutes left of the 10 you started with. I'd read fast. The channel didn't close. She simply stopped talking and let the silence do the rest of the work for her, which told Canna more about who he was dealing with than anything she'd actually said. He turned to Sorrel. Pull Article 12, full text, now. Her fingers found it in under a minute, this time because she'd clearly already had it cued. She read it aloud, and every word landed like a stone dropped into a pond that had no bottom. Full right of boarding, full right of inspection, full right of seizure for any craft failing to comply within the stated window. Signed, sealed, ratified by an imperial senate that had apparently decided 14 years ago this sector wasn't worth remembering. Thal's composure, 30 years of decorated service wrapped around him like armor, finally cracked at the edges. We have 12 planetary cannons. She has 47 ships we can't even get a clean read on and a hull we can't hit. I'm aware, fleet captain. Canna did not raise his voice, because raising it would have meant admitting how close it was to doing something else entirely. Which is why we are not going to test her 47 ships against our 12 cannons. He walked back to the command station and opened the channel himself this time, before she could close the window on him. Captain Oe, this is Admiral Canna. I've reviewed Article 12. I would like to formally request clarification on the inspection process outlined within it. We are prepared to comply. There was a pause on the other end, brief, considering. When she spoke again, something in her tone had shifted, not softer exactly, but less like a woman reading from a script and more like one actually looking at him. Smart man, Admiral. Most of your rank don't bite. They usually try to outweight me, and then I have to explain to my superiors why there's a debris field where an Imperial dreadnought used to be. I would prefer to avoid that outcome. So would I. Boarding coordinates incoming. Base 7, if that's still your primary, my intel says it usually is on ships your class. 12 inspection personnel, unarmed beyond standard sidearms, full compliance with your internal protocols, so long as nobody points anything larger than a hand weapon at my people. A beat. We'll be there in 11 minutes. The channel closed. For 3 full seconds nobody on the bridge said anything at all. Then Vask, quietly to no one. Her intel says usually on ships our class. He looked up at Canna. Sir, she knew our bay layout before we told her anything. Canna filed that away with the rest of the growing pile of things he did not yet have room to think about. 41 years since a Class 3 survey had called this species irrelevant, and the woman on the other end of that channel had walked into the conversation, already knowing more about his ship than half his own junior officers did. He gave the order to power down weapon systems, watched the bridge do it in the particular silence of people obeying a command they didn't like but understood, and then he did something that surprised even him. He pulled up the old survey file again, the 2 paragraphs, and read them once more while the countdown to Bay 7 ran in the corner of his display. No strategic concern, no monitoring required. He thought about the 11 minutes it would take a shuttle from an 80-kilometer warship to reach his bay, and wondered, not for the last time that night, exactly how much of the last 4 decades his empire had spent not watching. 11 minutes felt shorter than it should have. Base 7 had never hosted a docking this size. The human shuttle that eased through the outer doors ran 600 meters, sleek, matte black, running lights so dim they barely registered as light at all. It settled onto the deck without a sound, no scream of thrusters, no shudder through the hull, as if 600 meters of metal weighed nothing at all to the systems moving it. Canna stood at the head of his honor line with Thal at his shoulder, 12 of his own officers arranged in a formation meant to project calm. He was not certain, looking at the wall of black hull now filling half the bay, how convincing calm looked from the outside anymore. The ramp lowered. 12 figures walked down it in matte black suits, and the first thing Canna registered was the height. Every one of them stood well over 2 meters, dense through the shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with padding. The second thing he registered was the pace. They didn't march. They didn't hurry. They walked the way people walk through a room they already own, unbothered by an audience of imperial officers watching them the way prey watches something that hasn't decided yet whether it's hungry. The figure at the front removed her helmet without breaking stride. Dark skin, close-cropped hair, black eyes that found Canna's 3 pale ones and held them without flinching, without the small hesitation every other species he'd ever met betrayed in the first half-second of eye contact with an imperial officer. Captain Yara Oe looked, more than anything, like a woman finishing a task she'd done 100 times before and expected to do again. Admiral Canna, she said it the way a person confirms an appointment, not the way they greet a superior force. Thank you for the quick compliance. Makes my report shorter. Her team fanned out behind her without needing an order, spreading into a loose ring around the bay that Canna recognized, with a small, cold jolt, as textbook soft containment. Not aggressive, not obviously armed, simply positioned so that nothing in the room could move without 11 sets of eyes noticing first. Captain, Canna inclined his head, the smallest gesture the moment would allow him to keep his dignity intact. We're prepared to facilitate your inspection however you require. I appreciate that. Oe's gaze drifted past him, unhurried, taking in the bay, the crystalline architecture, the ceremonial coat he still wore even now. Something crossed her expression that might have been curiosity, might have been something closer to recognition. Nice ship. Old design, though. Velari Dreadnought Class 9, isn't it? It is. He kept his voice even, though something in the way she'd said old had already told him where this was going before she finished the thought. We have 3 of those in the Earth Military Museum. She said it lightly, almost kindly, the way a person delivers information they know will land hard and have decided not to soften. Decommissioned, obviously, popular with school groups. Behind him, Fleet Captain Thal made a very small sound, not quite a word, the sound of 30 years of pride meeting something it had no framework for. Canna said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have made it worse, and he was beginning to understand, slowly, the way ice understands its cracking, that this woman had not come here to gloat. She had simply told him the truth, and the truth had done all the damage on its own. Shall we begin? Oe asked, already walking toward the interior hatch, not waiting for his answer, entirely certain he would follow. He followed. The interior hatch sealed behind them with a sound too quiet for a door that size, and Oe stopped walking so abruptly that 2 of her officers nearly closed ranks around Canna before she raised one hand and stopped them. Before we go further, Admiral, I want to be straight with you about something, because I don't think you're going to like finding it out later more than you'll like hearing it now. She turned to face him fully, and for the first time since she'd stepped off the shuttle, the easy, unhurried calm in her voice sharpened into something with an edge. Your sensors can't get a clean mass reading on my hull. You've probably assumed that's a scanning fault on your end. I had assumed that, yes. It isn't. She nodded once to the officer beside her, who tapped something into a wrist display, and a schematic bloomed in the air between them, translucent, layered, unlike any hull cross-section Canna had ever studied. Folded state metamatter. The outer layer of my ship exists partially phased out of your local spacetime. Your weapons wouldn't transfer energy on contact. They'd pass through the surface layer like it wasn't there. Canna stared at the schematic and felt the last of his tactical assumptions quietly fold in on themselves, one after another, like a building coming down floor by floor with no sound at all. 12 planetary cannons. None of them would have mattered. How long has Earth had this? 11 years, give or take. She said it the way a person mentions how long they've owned a car. Give my engineers the summary version. It took a long time to be sure it wouldn't kill the crew testing it, longer than we'd have liked. A small pause, almost human in its weight. We lost people learning how to do it safely. It was the first thing she'd said all night that hadn't sounded entirely certain of itself, and Canna filed it away the way he filed everything, carefully and without comment. And the weapons systems, he said. The platforms my sensors counted. 60 confirmed, more unclassified. Something shifted in Oi's expression, not hostile, simply final. I'm going to decline that one, Admiral. Article 7 of the treaty covers weapons disclosure between signatory parties outside declared conflict. I'm happy to discuss hull architecture and inspection procedure. I'm not going to hand your Empire a targeting profile on my fleet just because you asked politely. That's fair, Canna said, and meant it, which surprised him more than anything she'd shown him so far. They walked on through a corridor that curved gently rather than turning at hard angles, lit by a soft, even glow that came from nowhere he could identify. No visible fixtures, no seams. 12 inspection officers moved through his ship's interior with the unhurried thoroughness of people running a checklist they'd run 1,000 times, checking systems, logging readings, occasionally exchanging a few quiet words in a language that wasn't galactic common and wasn't meant to be understood by anyone listening. It was near the end of the inspection, in a maintenance corridor 2 decks down, that Oe stopped in front of a data terminal and went still in a way that made Canna stop too. This your archive access? She asked. One of them. She reached out, not touching the panel, just studying it. Mind if I pull something? Won't take a minute. He gave the nod before he'd fully decided to, and watched her fingers move across an imperial interface with a familiarity that told him she'd done this exact motion before on some other ship, some other night. A file opened. 2 paragraphs, familiar to him now in a way that made his stomach fold the way the schematic had. The survey report, 41 years old, Class 3 developing. No strategic concern, no monitoring required. You've seen this, Canna said, and it wasn't a question. We've had a copy for 38 years. Oe said it without triumph, without anger, simply as fact, and that was somehow worse than either would have been. One of our diplomats got it through an information-sharing clause nobody on your side thought mattered at the time. It's been posted on a wall in the Officer Training Academy in Geneva since before I joined the service. She looked up at him. Every cadet reads it their first week. Most of them memorize it. Why? Because it's useful. She closed the file. Tell a species something is impossible, and mostly nothing happens. Tell them they're not worth watching, and see what 40 years of that particular kind of energy produces. She said it the way she'd said everything else tonight. Calm, unhurried, entirely without cruelty, which was exactly what made it land like a blade turning slowly instead of fast. We didn't build all this to prove you wrong, Admiral. We built it because you gave us 4 decades where nobody was checking. That's not an insult. That's just what happened. Canna said nothing for a long moment, because there was nothing in 30 years of naval doctrine that had prepared him for standing in his own corridor being told, gently, that his empire's contempt had been the fuel. 2 decks up, in the Eternal Dominion's near-empty officers' mess, Fleet Captain Thal sat alone with a cup of recycled tea going cold in front of him, untouched, staring at nothing. He hadn't spoken since the museum comment. He didn't touch the cup now either. He was simply waiting, the way a man waits for a verdict he already knows the shape of. Back on the bridge, Sensor Chief Vask worked through a final data pass on the sensor logs from the last 2 hours, mostly out of habit, mostly because sitting idle felt worse than working. His panel chimed once. He frowned, leaned in, and went very still. "Sir," his voice, when it reached Canna's two decks down, had none of its earlier tremor in it. It had gone flat instead, the particular flatness of a man who has just found something he wishes he hadn't. "You need to see the full sensor sweep. Now." Canna excused himself from Oi's side and pulled up the feed on a nearby panel. The 47 ships his crew had logged as debris hours ago now resolved into a formation, and the formation told a story the raw count never had. They weren't scattered. They were positioned, evenly spaced across 500,000 kilometers, each one holding a vector that put it exactly one jump from every major approach into the sector. Not a patrol, not a show of force sitting idle. A net that had been drawn tight around the eternal dominion since before her sensors had ever registered the first contact. "They knew we were coming," Vask said quietly, "before we knew they existed. They've had this formation in place for," he checked the timestamps twice, disbelieving his own numbers, "over a week." Canna looked at the schematic, at the quiet, perfect geometry of it, and felt something colder than fear settle into place. This hadn't been a response to an intrusion. It had been a trap set, and waiting, patient, for exactly the kind of mistake his empire had been making for 41 years, without ever once checking whether it still applied. He turned back to find Oe watching him from the corridor, arms loose at her sides, no urgency in her posture at all, as if she already knew precisely what he'd just found and had simply been waiting for him to catch up. "You set the net before we ever crossed into the zone," he said. "We set the net 11 years ago, Admiral, right after we finished the hull program. This is just the first time anyone's been foolish enough to test it." She held his gaze, steady, unbothered. "There are things your empire and mine are going to need to discuss. Boundaries, mutual recognition, and certain policies about how developing species get classified and how long anyone's allowed to go without checking again." Somewhere behind him, faint through the open channel, he heard Thal set his cold tea down without drinking it, and the small, ordinary sound of ceramic on metal felt, in that moment, louder than anything the last 2 hours had thrown at him. Thal didn't drink the tea. He never would. He set the cup aside and rose to stand at his station as the inspection teams filed back toward Bay 7, unhurried, task complete, 12 officers moving through the ship the same way they'd entered it, like people who had never once doubted the outcome. At the airlock, Oe paused before stepping through. "You're free to leave the zone, Admiral. My government will send a formal note through your capital's communication array. I'd expect it within a few weeks." She studied him a moment longer, something almost gentle in it now that the inspection was behind her. "For what it's worth, you handled tonight better than most would have. That'll matter later." "Captain," he held her gaze with all three eyes steady now, no flicker, no desync. "Why tell me any of this? The report, the 38 years, the wall in Geneva. You didn't need to." She considered that, honestly, the way she seemed to consider everything. "Because the 2 paragraphs did their job on us. Somebody ought to know it worked before your side writes another one about the next species you decide isn't worth watching." She turned toward the airlock. "Tell us something is impossible, Admiral, and watch what happens. Tell us we're not worth watching and see what 40 years of that energy produces. No triumph in it. Just a fact she'd been carrying a long time, finally set down." The airlock sealed. The 600-meter shuttle peeled away without ceremony, and the Eternal Dominion sat alone in the dark, disarmed, inspected, released, exactly as small as she had always secretly been and had simply never been told. Canna walked to his private office 2 decks down. He did not summon Thal. He did not summon Vask or Sorrel. He sat, and the door sealed behind him, and for the first time that night there was no one left to perform composure for. He opened the survey file. 2 paragraphs. Class 3 developing. No strategic concern. No monitoring required. 41 years old, and somewhere on a wall in a city called Geneva, cadets had been reading it every week since before he'd made fleet captain, turning contempt into fuel one graduating class at a time. He thought of the coat he still wore, ceremonial, inherited from a service tradition older than the report itself. a tradition built on the quiet, unexamined belief that nothing out here could ever grow past where the last survey had left it. His third eye blinked out of sync. He let it. There was no one to hide it from now, and for the first time in 30 years, he understood that this, the small involuntary stutter of a body catching up to what the mind already knew, was simply what fear felt like when it arrived not as a threat, but as recognition. Not they are coming for us. Just, we already lost, and didn't notice for 41 years. He opened a blank report and began to write. His hand did not shake. 4 hours later, he was still writing. He wrote that Earth's hull technology exceeded anything in the Imperial shipyards by a margin his own engineers would need years to close. He wrote that the treaty signed 14 years ago by a Senate that had since forgotten it existed had turned Imperial strength into Imperial vulnerability the moment anyone chose to test it. He wrote, in the final paragraph, the sentence that would end up quoted in 3 separate Senate hearings over the following weeks. I submit that this represents a fundamental failure of our intelligence doctrine regarding developing species, not a failure of force, but a failure of watching. He did not mention his own third eye. Some things belonged only to the man who'd felt them. 3 weeks later, a note arrived through the primary communication array of the Imperial capital, formal, equal to equal in its language, signed by Earth's Secretary of State. Every monitoring species across 3 systems noticed it land, because notes written in that register did not arrive from Class 3 worlds, and everyone who read it understood, in the same instant Canna had, that the category itself had already stopped meaning anything. At the bottom, beneath the formal seals, someone had added a line by hand. We believe in a galaxy where species are measured by what they build rather than how they are classified. We hope you do too. The Senate debated for 11 days. Canna was not in the chamber for most of it, but he heard, secondhand, that his after-action report was read aloud twice, in full, by members who wanted the record to show exactly how the failure had been described by the officer who'd lived it. On the 12th day, the Senate accepted the summit. 6 weeks after that, the recognition treaty was signed on neutral ground, along with a trade framework neither side had expected to need this soon, and an annex, the 7th, that rewrote how the Empire was permitted to survey a developing species going forward. Consultation, transparency, independent oversight. No more 2 paragraphs filed and forgotten for 41 years. The first Earth embassy opened in the Imperial capital on a bright, ordinary morning. No fanfare beyond what protocol required. Canna attended in his old ceremonial coat, standing near the back where admirals who no longer had anything to prove tended to stand. Above the entrance, beneath the embassy seal, a motto had been carved in 12 languages, plain black letters on pale stone. The same words Oe had said to him in a maintenance corridor with no anger in her voice at all. We were not worth watching. Look at us now. He read it once. He did not need to read it twice. He thought briefly of the Teethal had never finished drinking, of Vask's flat voice reporting a formation 11 years in the waiting, of 2 paragraphs that had somehow outlived their own author's confidence. He thought of a report he had written in 4 hours in the dark, and of a Senate that had needed 11 days to accept what one dreadnought's crew had understood in one night. He turned from the embassy wall and walked back toward the transport that would take him home. He did not look back. He didn't need to. He already understood.